Hello again. In the last segment, we talked about the difference between the way Paul talks about Jesus Christ and his relationship with God the Father, and how John presents, in a much more bold way, the place of Christ in God's purpose, even calling him explicitly God and I am. Now, in the next segment, we're talking about the development of the doctrine of Christ in the Apostolic and Ante-Nicene Fathers. I'll read straight from the document. This is the period, by the way, from 100 AD till about 250. We see, not astonishingly, a more dogmatic insistence on the deity of Christ in the earliest post-apostolic testimony. Ignatius, for example, on his way to martyrdom at Rome, flies in the face of both Docetic heretics and the imperial cult, which had taken to worshipping Caesar as both Lord and God, in his insistence that not only was Christ true man, he was also fully God. Now, just as a footnote, the Docetic tendency is that tendency you see even in the beginning in the New Testament to somehow challenge the idea that Christ had a true human body and was therefore truly human. So in the first generation after the apostles, Ignatius, around the year 110 to 115, is very insistent that Christ was both fully man and fully God. Justin, another martyr for the faith around a generation later, around 150 AD, also testifies to the true deity of Christ. By this time, it was already well known among outsiders that Christ was worshipped in the assemblies of believers. The Roman records testify to that, by the way. For the early church, both Jewish and pagan in background, it appears that it was not as difficult to believe that Christ was true God as it was to believe that true God could become true man. The rapidly emerging dogmatic constructions, which 2 centuries later would lead to the full flowering of Trinitarianism, were already being worked out by the apologists and theologians of the 2nd century, who had to give an answer to the intelligent questions of pagans who demanded to know how this worship of Jesus of Nazareth, a Jewish man, could be reconciled with the monotheism of Judaism. The church, which had at first worshipped Christ in spirit, that means more or less spontaneously, as it were, without fully grasping intellectually the significance of what they did, now struggled to give an intellectual structure to its faith and a rational defense for its seemingly contradictory beliefs. In so doing, defenses of the faith such as Justin or Irenaeus or Origen inevitably drew upon the thought world of their pagan neighbors in trying to reconcile this new faith with Greek thought forms. This attempt to explain the dogmas of emergent Trinitarianism in Greek terminology is misunderstood as compromise with paganism by anti-Trinitarians. Indeed, the attempt to marry Christian doctrine with Greek philosophy was even condemned by Tertullian, a contemporary of these apologists. Nevertheless, the church was attempting to make the Christian faith intelligible to the thinking pagan, who often was trained in the school of Plato and his philosophical descendants. And in so doing, the fathers were only imitating the Apostle Paul, who translated Old Testament theology into the language of the philosophers in Athens in Acts chapter 17. And they were also following the example of the Lord himself, who translated his divinity into the form of a servant to bring us to the Father. Philippians 2 verse 7. Now, my source for most of this development of Christian Christology, as I said before, read maybe a dozen books on the subject, and that was only a sampling, but I tried to do a representative sampling. Here's some of the books written from a mostly evangelical viewpoint. Howard Marshall's book, The Origins of New Testament Christology. Richard Longenecker's book, The Christology of Early Jewish Christianity. And most famously, Benjamin Warfield of Princeton Seminary, Lord of Glory. Those are the more conservative sources. And then mainstream, some would call them liberal sources. James Dunn, Christology in the Making. C.F.D. Moule, The Origin of Christology. Vincent Taylor, The person of Christ in New Testament teaching. William Ramsay, not the William Ramsay we talked about, the great archaeologist, a more modern Ramsay, the Christ of the earliest Christians. William Sanday, Christologies Ancient and Modern. And lastly, Oscar Coleman, the Christology of the New Testament. All of these were very helpful, and as I said, they were just a sampling of what's available out there. There's no subject more interesting and more humbling than studying the history of the development of thought about God in Christ, and the resources are immense, so none of us have an excuse for not tapping into those resources. And yes, they're still being written, which means men are still struggling to reconcile the data of Scripture with our limited human understanding.